Subscribe to my YouTube channel for more emotional and heart-touching stories like this one. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Noah sat on the cold kitchen floor, his tiny fingers gripping a crumpled sheet of paper. His handwriting, shaky and uneven, filled the page as tears slipped down his cheeks. He was just a little boy, barely 7 years old, but the weight on his small shoulders was heavier than most grown-ups could imagine. Outside, the neighborhood kids were laughing, playing with snowballs, building snowmen. But inside this little house, nothing felt like winter magic. It felt like winter was stealing something instead. Noah's sister, Emily, was only 9, but she looked much smaller now. The illness had made her weak, pale, and quiet. The doctors said her condition was serious and that she needed a surgery, one that could save her life. But it cost more than Noah's mom could ever afford. Noah had heard it all, whispered in late-night talks between his mother and the doctors, thinking he was asleep. He wasn't. He listened to every word and clung to every sentence, hoping to hear the word miracle, but it never came. Their mother, Rachel, worked double shifts at a local diner, serving coffee with a tired smile that rarely reached her eyes anymore. Noah could tell how worried she was, even when she tried to be brave. He saw the stack of unpaid bills hidden behind the bread box. He saw her stare at Emily's hospital prescriptions, like they were written in another language. Money, that's all anyone seemed to talk about. Noah didn't fully understand how money worked, but he knew enough. They didn't have it, and Emily didn't have time. So, Noah came up with a plan. It wasn't the kind of plan you'd see in movies, with big dramatic rescues or magical cures. It was simple, maybe even foolish to some, but to Noah, it was all he had. He started writing letters, not to Santa, not to superheroes, but to strangers. Rich strangers. He remembered overhearing someone at the diner mention a list of wealthy people who lived in the city, businessmen, CEOs, celebrities, people who could spend thousands without blinking. To Noah, they weren't just names. They were hope. Noah sat by the window every night after finishing his homework, scribbling down letter after letter. They weren't perfect. Some had spelling mistakes. Some were smudged with tears. But they were honest. Each one began the same. Dear rich person, my name is Noah, and I need your help to save my sister. He poured his heart out, explaining how Emily used to dance around the house, how she made the best paper airplanes, how she was brave even when she was scared, and how the doctors said they needed money to make her better. Some nights, he would fall asleep right there, his head resting on his scribbled words, dreaming of someone finding the letters and rushing to help. In the mornings, he'd wake up early and quietly drop the envelopes into random mailboxes on his way to school. No return address, no phone number, just hope sealed inside. Meanwhile, Emily's condition worsened. She spent more and more days at the hospital, and the house felt emptier, without her laughter echoing through the walls. Rachel tried to stay strong for both of them, but Noah noticed how her hands trembled when she held Emily's hand, or how she sat in the dark kitchen after Noah went to bed, silently crying, and still no one came. Every afternoon, Noah would race home, checking the mailbox, hoping for a miracle letter. But day after day, it remained empty. Neighbors came and went. The postman smiled politely, unaware of the desperate little boy chasing him down the street every time he passed by. The world kept moving like nothing was wrong, and Noah, he kept writing. Then one evening, just as Noah was about to give up, something strange happened. A black car, shiny and expensive, pulled up in front of their worn-down little house. Noah peeked through the curtain, his heart pounding. A tall man in a dark suit stepped out, holding one of Noah's letters, folded carefully in his hand. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the house, like he wasn't sure if he should even be there. Noah's breath caught in his throat. Could this be it? Could this be the person who might save Emily? Or was it just another grown-up here to tell them what they couldn't afford? Before Noah could decide what to do, the man raised his hand and knocked on the door, and that's where this part of the story ends. Rachel hesitated as she opened the door, unsure of who this stranger could be. The tall man adjusted his coat, cleared his throat, and softly said, "Hi, I'm looking for Noah." His voice wasn't cold like Noah expected. It was careful, almost unsure. Rachel blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, who?" she asked. The man held up the letter Noah had written. "He wrote this," he said, "about his sister." Rachel's eyes widened. She turned her head slightly, spotting Noah hiding behind the curtain, clutching it tightly, eyes wide with fear and hope all at once. Rachel stepped outside, closing the door gently behind her. She didn't want Noah to hear, but Noah was already pressing his ear against the door. The man introduced himself as Mr. Bennett, a businessman who had randomly found Noah's letter in his office mailbox. He admitted that at first, he thought it was just another prank or a scam, but something about Noah's words, raw, innocent, and painfully honest, stuck with him. "I don't usually involve myself personally," Mr. Bennett explained, "but I don't know, this one felt different." Inside, Noah sat on the floor listening, his heart pounding. He wanted to believe this was the answer, but fear whispered, "What if he says no?" Rachel, tired and desperate, didn't know how to respond. Mr. Bennett noticed her hesitation and softened his voice. "Look, I'm not here to make promises I can't keep, but I'd like to know more about Emily, about what you're going through." Rachel's shoulders sank. She hadn't had anyone ask her that in a long time. She quietly invited him in. Later, that evening, the small living room, once filled only with silence and worry, now held Mr. Bennett's deep voice, asking questions about Emily's condition. He listened closely as Rachel explained everything: the bills, the diagnosis, the surgery, and the painful reality that time was running out. Noah sat on the edge of the couch, watching Mr. Bennett's face, trying to read him like a storybook. Was he kind? Was he just pretending? Or was he really the miracle Noah had been hoping for? As Mr. Bennett was leaving, he turned to Noah and gave a small smile. "Thank you for writing to me. That took courage." Noah nodded, but his eyes were searching for something deeper. Hope. A yes. Anything. Mr. Bennett promised he would think about it and left. Days passed, but no word came. Noah watched the street every afternoon, hoping the black car would return. Meanwhile, Emily grew weaker. The nurses and doctors did their best, but Noah could see it. The spark in her eyes was fading. Rachel tried to stay strong, but even her brave face was beginning to crack. One night, Noah couldn't take it anymore. He sneaked out and went to the diner where his mother worked. There, he sat at the corner booth, scribbling more letters, this time even more desperate. Some were written to other wealthy people he had heard about, others just to anyone he thought might listen. He handed them out to strangers, slid them under doors, and even tried to pin one to the community board outside the grocery store. He didn't care if people laughed at him. He couldn't lose Emily. Across town, Mr. Bennett sat in his luxurious office, the city lights glowing behind him. He kept glancing at Noah's letter on his desk, Something about it haunted him. The words weren't asking for anything fancy, just a chance for Emily to live. He thought about his own daughter, now grown and distant, and about the years he had wasted choosing work over family. That letter wasn't just about Noah and Emily. It was about him too. The next morning, just as Rachel was getting ready to leave for another long shift, there was a knock at the door again. Noah ran to it before she could even react. Mr. Bennet stood there, but this time he wasn't alone. Beside him was a woman, Mrs. Harper, who Rachel recognized as a kind-hearted nurse who volunteered for a charity that helped families like theirs. They stepped inside, and Noah could feel something was different. Mr. Bennet wasn't just visiting this time. He was here to do something. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. Before anyone even spoke, Mr. Bennet explained that he had reached out to the charity and several friends. They had pulled together enough money, not just for the surgery, but also to help with the medical bills and aftercare. Rachel dropped into the nearest chair, overwhelmed. Noah stood frozen. Unsure if he had heard correctly, Mr. Bennet knelt in front of Noah and smiled gently. "Your letters worked, Noah," he said. "You did it." But before relief could fully set in, the phone rang. Rachel picked it up, and her face went pale. It was the hospital. Emily's condition had taken a sudden turn. The doctor's voice, on the other end, sounded worried. Urgent. They needed to get there. Now. Without wasting a second, Mr. Bennet offered to drive them. The family, with Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Harper, rushed to the hospital, hearts racing. Noah sat quietly in the back seat, holding his mother's hand tightly, praying with all his might as the hospital came into view. Flashing lights outside the emergency room made Rachel's heart drop. The car barely stopped when they jumped out and ran inside. And that's where this part of the story ends. The hospital hallways were filled with the steady hum of machines and the hurried footsteps of nurses. But to Noah, everything felt like a blur. He clung tightly to Rachel's hand as they rushed toward Emily's room. Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Harper followed close behind, their expressions tense and worried. When they finally reached the ICU, the doctor stood outside the door, his face serious. "We're doing everything we can," he said softly, "but you need to be with her now." Inside the room, Emily looked smaller than ever, her tiny body surrounded by wires and monitors. Rachel rushed to her side, tears falling freely, while Noah stood frozen in the doorway. His brave little heart broke at the sight. Slowly, he walked over and gently grabbed Emily's hand. Her eyelids fluttered open, and the faintest smile appeared when she saw them. "Hey you," Noah whispered, fighting back his tears. Rachel begged the doctor to let them stay a little longer. Just then, Mr. Bennet stepped forward and asked, "Can we speak privately?" Moments later, Mr. Bennet returned with the doctor, exchanging quiet words Noah couldn't hear. The doctor nodded, and for the first time that night, a flicker of hope returned. Mr. Bennet had not only arranged for the funds, but he had already cleared everything for an emergency surgery that could happen immediately if Rachel consented. Time was not on their side, but with no other option left, Rachel nodded through tears. The surgical team was called in, and within minutes, Emily was being prepped. Noah watched helplessly as the doctors wheeled her away, the soft beeping of machines fading as the doors shut behind her. The waiting room felt like the longest night of their lives. Noah sat curled up on the couch, staring at the floor, while Rachel paced silently. Mr. Bennet sat quietly nearby, unsure if he had done enough. Hours passed with no news. Every time the door opened, Noah's heart leapt, only to sink again when it wasn't the doctor. Finally, just as the sun was beginning to rise, the doctor returned. His face, usually calm and unreadable, now carried a gentle smile. "She made it," he said. "The surgery was successful." Rachel gasped and covered her mouth as tears of relief spilled out. Noah blinked in disbelief, unsure if he had heard correctly. "She's going to be okay?" he asked. The doctor nodded. "Yes, she's resting now, but she's out of danger." Noah threw his arms around his mother, and for the first time, in what felt like forever, they cried happy tears. Even Mr. Bennet found himself wiping at his eyes, overwhelmed by the quiet power of this simple, beautiful moment. Over the next few days, Emily slowly regained her strength. The color returned to her cheeks, and the sparkle Noah loved so much came back to her eyes. The hospital room, once heavy with worry, now echoed with soft laughter and whispered dreams of what they would do once Emily was back home. Mr. Bennet visited daily, sometimes bringing little gifts, other times just sitting quietly as Noah told him silly stories or shared drawings of their future adventures. He even helped Rachel organize support from Mrs. Harper's charity, which offered therapy, school supplies, and help getting them back on their feet. As the days turned into weeks, Rachel found herself realizing that for the first time, they weren't alone anymore, not just because of the charity or the money, but because someone cared enough to stay. Eventually the day came when Emily was strong enough to go home. As they stepped out of the hospital, Noah spotted the tree where he had once sat writing those letters. He tugged on Mr. Bennet's coat and whispered, "Thank you for listening." Mr. Bennet knelt down, smiling. "Thank you for writing," he replied. The world didn't magically become perfect. There were still challenges ahead. Bills would still come, and life would still be messy and unpredictable, but now they faced it together. They had hope. They had each other. And for Noah, that was more than enough. In the weeks that followed, Noah's letters continued, not asking for help anymore, but sharing updates, drawings, and stories about Emily's recovery. Mr. Bennet always wrote back. What started as a desperate cry for help had become the foundation of an unlikely friendship, one built not on wealth or charity alone, but on the simple, powerful truth that sometimes it just takes one person to listen. And so, with the wind softly blowing through the trees and Emily's laughter filling the air once again, Noah knew deep down he didn't just save his sister, he saved their family.